Okay, hey guys, we're back. I'm going to have you do the same thing as we've done last time, pull up the lecture notes, which I will post at the same time I post this video. We're going to start with Carmen Comes Home, a marvelous work of art. I include all of that in the quotations so that you type in the whole thing. It's not me saying it's a marvelous work of art, that's what's going to get you to it on YouTube. What you will notice probably the first thing, if I had showed this to you in class, is the brightness of the color that looks like nothing that we have shown before in class. This specifically is Fuji color, and we'll get to that later in the notes, and it emerges on the market obviously to compete with Western versions, Technicolor specifically, of color films, and you can even compare it. I think I usually do that in other classes, but I won't pull anything up for you now. If you take that and you look and you type in something with Technicolor, Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a great one, and then compare, you can see the difference in the color and how vibrant it is specifically. One of the things that I would do if, again, this were a lecture is I would talk about the LA Rebellion, because this is our critical race theory class, and how expensive it was to get that kind of film, but how important it was to some of those black filmmakers during civil rights. Why, the question would you ask? Because when color technologies are developed around who's the hero, right? It's always these very pale, white, heroic people who's also the love interest, right? It's going to make their skin specifically, and they're testing them on what we call Shirley cards to see what is the correct like lighting scale in order to include in these technologies. So naturally, if you are finally starting to film a black population and you want to do that ethically, you are going to go to Fujifilm for that, because they have much different variations in skin tones over there with Asian populations. They have different darker skins that also have to be accounted for, and so that was the best quality that they could get for in terms of like color fidelity, right, to ethically light black skin. But we won't go too far into that this time. We're going to keep moving on. I would have you watch that clip right now. If you want to pause at any time, go ahead and watch it. Or you can obviously keep listening to the lecture, then watch it if you want to know first what that's about. So this is one of the great examples. You can see it's 1951, so it is post-war. By the mid-50s, about 60% of the films are coming from Japan, which makes them the second largest in that time. This is not true anymore. We've listed this, I think, 2 times in this class, but this is the exam you need to know this by, so we've kind of preemptively reviewed this material. What 2 are the next largest producers now? And the easy way to remember this so that you don't have to go back to your notes and you can really quickly get through this question on your test and use it for more productive means is what rhymes with Hollywood, right? So obviously we have Bollywood, which is India, right? And then we have Nollywood, which is Nigeria. And they are producing a butt ton of films because they have a diaspora that exists, a global diaspora, and all of those communities around the world are watching these movies still as this part of like cultural heritage. So by the mid-50s, some Asian countries are producing more films than any European countries, South Korea and Philippines. In 1954, we get the first Asian Film Festival in Japan. And that's the reason why I included this Carmen Comes Home clip, because if I were to ask you, what are the aesthetics? What is the plot like? Well, you have this kind of hero, right? And you see this very linear conception of time. There is almost nothing that is different from anything that we've seen produced before. And that's because everything that does well, typically in film festivals at this time, that certainly has changed since. Films that do well here are accepted and modeled on Hollywood classical style. Like I said, this is why we approach this from a very Eurocentric viewpoint, this whole class, because Hollywood is one of those few industries that genuinely does develop out of this very US like cultural like kind of dominant, right? And obviously European cinema as well with the art cinemas and whatnot, but it develops out of almost entirely as a very and especially since we're about to talk about what is neocolonialism, right, in the next paragraph, it's almost a colonialist industry, right? It's this dominant global field which favors the people who were already financially empowered, essentially. So let's talk about that. The colonies finally start breaking away from disintegrating European empires. So this means everything that was colonized in the past physically by force by these empires, Indonesia, Cuba, Pakistan, communist revolution in China is finally successful. U.S. essentially gets scared that all of Asia is going to go communist, and most of the colonized countries at this point are going to end up allying with Western powers. And the reason for that is not because anyone is forcing them to. Remember, they're now free. They're having independence and revolutions and whatnot. No one says you have to. This is what we call neocolonialism. And the difference here, a good point going forward, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again because I continue to get questions for it throughout. That's just how the semester works as people get increasingly scared about their exam grades, right? We start getting questions about how can I do well? What should I be studying? Anytime I include a question on here, that is something you should know for the exam. The reason that I don't include what it is in the notes is because I expect you to write it down because we're going to go into it and explain it. So what is the difference between neocolonialism and traditional colonialism? Well, colonialism is using force, right? And that's explicit force. This is not to say that neocolonialism does not use force, but it uses economic force, right? So if you're emerging on this new market, and you're trying to develop, and these already developed nations who, through colonialism, have completely dominated the entire trade that is becoming increasingly global. Different places are becoming known for different products on the global field for what you're going to exchange. And this is what in your economics class you will start to learn about how it becomes more productive and more financially financially valuable for each. Even if one can produce more of something else and less of something, but then they own more of a position of the market of this less something that they can produce, they're going to do better with this, right? So everyone's starting the beginning of strategically thinking, where do I fit in this global sphere? And if that question is historically, these people dominate the financial sphere, and they also historically now dominate the in World War II and in World War I, right? You probably want to be on their good side going forward. So this is if you were to say, do they really have a choice to comply with U.S. commercialism? The answer is probably no. But if anyone were to say, were they forced into it, right? Were they forced into these kinds of economic trade deals and whatnot? Yes, but in a neo-colonialist way, right? Not in a traditional use of force, aka they conquered the nation and they took control and put their government officials in there, right? This is, again, the difference between, like we say, form and content, whereas we get a revolution, and now all of the officials that live in these places are officials that are genuinely from these places. But how is that any different from having, it's going to be a little different, of course, right? But when there have been generations upon generations of this is why the new generation is what is at stake in Pan's Labyrinth, right? When there have been generations upon generations upon generations who have all lived under the norms of colonialist rule, there is not going to be so much different. The content, the surface level content will change, but the only thing that those people know about norms, about how political systems should work, right, are ways that it has been run before. This is the format, even if they're changing some of the things up to better suit their people as going forward. So colonialism has already done the violence and has already worked its way into the societal workings of these places and the cultural workings of these places. Okay. Post-war Japanese cinema. So now we're finally talking about specifically what happens post-war. World War II devastates Japan. Atomic bomb, 1945. This is also the end of World War II, remember? Then comes what we call the Japanese New Wave. And as we move forward, we're going to talk about a few different new waves. We have the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, which is called SCAB, which is hilarious. Refashion Japanese society and develop a peace constitution designed not to wage war at all. So rural landlords are given to tenant farmers who create a bunch of universities. Women get the right to vote in divorce. Inheritance laws are liberalized. Progress is essentially defined by how Western countries have defined it in the past. What's happening is, hold on. I am dehydrated. What is happening is that Japan is not getting to define what progress means going forward socially, right? They've lost that. Apparently to the U.S. they have lost that right, right? And so we're thinking we got to progress them towards these liberalized values. And then the U.S. obviously goes, uh-oh, when they realize that, let me get to that point, it'll be hilarious to you by the time we get there, it's at the end of this next paragraph anyways. August 1945 to June 1952, U.S. occupies Japan. I just said that, didn't I? Advancements mainly a result of U.S. occupation and our definition of progress. So occupation of Japan gives us a site to stage intervention in Korea. First of all, we are now super close geographically, and also to produce war materials to discourage communist China, right? Very Cold War type tensiony things. We're super close, so this creates more pressure. Initially, the U.S. encourages labor unions, right? And what was the role of labor unions that we just saw in exam 2? And developing the U.S. This is where we get things like minimum wage, right? It says that if you are working 40 hours per week, you should be able to afford the costs of living that are happening right now. This is where we get things like, if I accidentally lose a hand, right, my employer it should be responsible. Like these basic human rights afforded to workers who it's very easy to exploit workers if you don't have these in place. We're like, yeah, that's part of what it means to make progress. And then as soon as we start to associate labor unions with collectivization, and we start to also associate it with communism, and we scale back the rights that we allow laborers over there to have and the types of progress they're allowed to make towards giving a little more power to the people and less to the big conglomerations, right? Which is ironic thinking about what was going on in the US at the time. We have zero problem with the disgusting use of internment camps up until that point, right? And those human rights violations, like literally detaining Japanese people and Japanese citizens, right? It's that we do not want to be associated with the same practices as China, and it is workers' rights that's suddenly too far, right? This is the logic of money making. One of them steps too far towards allowing someone else to be competitive on a global scale. The other one is for us, right? And it allows us to appease our fears. And so that's the difference between them. Japan deserves most of the credit for rebuilding their economy and not the U.S., even though the U.S. is kind of the watchdog, keeping watch and allowing certain things and pushing certain things. They had this huge economic capacity move from military power that they directed towards civilian power. And they mobilized it strategically in a very specific way. And here's the second question that we are about to address right now that you should write down, because if you are only reading these lecture notes, right, and not watching the actual lecture, you won't have this. So what is the major way that Japan deliberately and strategically positions themselves in terms of a global economy going forward that I will address in the lecture, this being here? Typically when I ask that question to my class, sometimes I get it, most times I don't. Most times I get what is usually the result of that. People will say things like technology, right, or industrialization, anything that has to do with like these very manufacturing economy type things, but that's what China becomes known for, right? China becomes our big manufacturing economy, which is traditionally associated with developing nations, right? Not developed nations. Developed nations now are starting to move towards service economies, which allows for modernism to come about, and eventually postmodernism, which is what we're looking towards, right? So what we're addressing here in all of these new waves is essentially a modernist aesthetic that is starting to produce as a result of these things. And the big thing that Japan invests in is people, right? It invests in education. Literally, education is the sector that they hit hard on, and that means intelligence. And that is the perfect place if you want to be located in a developed economy, in this service economy, in which goods are now predominantly intangible, right? Especially finance economies, where what are you selling? Nothing. It's a digital transaction thing that's happening. You need people who are smart and predictive and who know things and can make algorithms and whatnot. Okay, so they invest in education, and that is the resulting, that is why people tend to say technology. That is what results from the investment in education. It's the people-centered investment. So in terms of cinema, U.S. is trying to eliminate the popularity of feudalism. That's samurai stuff. This essentially is, essentially they're saying progress by Western values. Let's get rid of all the stuff that makes you you, right? Any of your like historic heritage. And nationalism, which is heritage pride. Nationalism is typically associated with, again, super conservative, right? Conservative in the term that you want to conserve old values. Conservative movements, and this can be anywhere, right? And nationalism is almost always associated with fascism, right? Because it doesn't have to be. This is not to say that nationalism is fascism. When you think of what happens when you start to care about your country and your values and whatever you have, when you care about you as a nation, this creates an other, right? In which you are better, others are worse. And especially as we are starting to move towards a globalized economy where everything needs to work as this community-centered kinds of things, nationalism is very pro-borders, right? It's very, even like the French, which is not fascist. It is completely known for its, historically known for its workers' uprisings, right? And that's why they because they have a culture of it, that's why they continually have them over the years, and that's why they continually get, increases in workers' rights, because people rise up and they protest because they see that as a norm. But France is also known for its nationalism, right? Where did we see that? With quotas. So this is not to say that these are one and the same. Nationalism is not fascism, but almost always when a fascist movement actually ends up making it and bubbling up and making it to the surface, it is a result of nationalist calls to action, to preserve what is the Germanness of Nazi Germany, right? To say we are German, and what that means is to be white and Aryan and not Jewish. These are the foreigners who are, intruding, who are permeating our borders and infiltrating. This is the type of nationalism I'm talking about, right? So it doesn't have to be, but almost always it is, nationalism is an anxiety response that comes out of the need to conserve what you see as a purer heritage, right? A heritage before things progress towards a globalized sense in which we're sharing community and cultural values. Okay, so this is one of the things. So they're starting to do that from Japanese cinema. They're saying you have to progress, and we define progress in this very specific Western way. U.S. government is banning films in Japan while they're in charge. Many end up being burned by the Allies without saving the negatives, because if you're scared of this communist infiltration, you're scared of them retaining their heritage, they burn them. What is the problem with that we talked about the first week of class? They end up being lost forever. They're highly flammable. They're not easily restored like that. They need to be preserved. Film preservation is such an issue, which is why 75% preservation that we have in the U.S. is a lot. It's a ton, right? And again, who is afforded that? Typically the people who were the colonizers, right? The bad guys in history who like killed a ton of other people because they were powerful and they can. So we have the right to preserve that. U.S. And that's also why we talk about the importance of memory, right? Because undervalued populations, if you don't get to record history from your perspective, remember the fiction is reality that we base this class upon, if you don't get to be the dominant narrative of what even happened in history, and this is what the whole movie is about that I assigned to you, right? And each one of those characters is representing allegorically a different perspective in terms of World War II, which we are not going to discuss too much. I would love to have an entire class devoted to that because it's one of my favorite movies to talk about. But unfortunately, digital things have changed that, right? So U.S. is insisting on Japanese people the importance of memory. I completely got off track. The importance of memory is that history is literally just a narrative of what happens from a particular nation's perspective. And that's always going to look different depending on what nation you're in, and then who gets to decide the dominant narrative of what happened. This is again the Ophelia versus the captain. That's what they were fighting for, the narrative. They're fighting for whose narrative wins, who gets to write history, who gets to say who was the official good guy and who was the official bad guy, when really there is no such thing, right? U.S. insists on Japanese people kissing on screen. I thought that was a hilarious tidbit, one of those things that you don't really need to know, but to include to give you to paint you a picture, right? To aestheticize this point in history of what's going on. U.S. thinks it democratizes and modernizes them, yet discourages leftism, right? Because now they're caught in this tension between, oh, we want to progress you, but not too far, like not too leftism, like we're allowed to have kind of thing. You get a certain level of progress, and that's it. So initially, Japan's industry is made up of three companies, all vertically integrated. Independent companies do grow a bit during occupation. At the same time, their vertically integrated companies continue to grow, and the U.S. actually suppresses the strikes of the major film industries, which they never did back home. So Japan ends up with 6 major studios integrated, and the U.S. floods the market with U.S. films. But at that point, remember, Japan is producing about 500 films per year by 1960, and they've invested in Fujicolor to compete with the Technicolor. So it's not like, even though the U.S. is flooding their market with U.S. films, it's like they've also already influenced the content. So it's not like people are only watching U.S. films or anything. They're also watching these very westernized versions of genuinely Japanese narratives, right? So now we're going to talk about Ozu. We're going to talk about both Ozu and Kurosawa, who Kurosawa is the director of the film that I had you watch for this class. Let me go ahead and pull up. I should have pulled this up. That's fine. I'll go back to it later. So we're talking about Ozu right now. Actually, we'll just talk about them kind of, because it looks like in the notes I haven't looked at these notes in a while. It looks like I've kind of like weaved them together to make comparisons. The things you should know about this is that I would skip ahead to the end where I post this explicitly, where Kurosawa is not exactly representative of Japanese filmmaking. Ozu, the one we're about to talk about real quick, is probably the most Japanese in terms of what we're thinking of in new wave and auteur filmmaking. Anytime that you say something like new wave and auteur, you should be thinking of the actual artists within the national scene, right? So who is not as influenced by this Hollywood type style. Kurosawa is the most Western of Japanese films, and this is a distinction you should know. Which one of these is considered the most Japanese in this time in terms of new wave, and which one is considered the most Western. The reason I have you watch the Kurosawa film, who is the most Western, why would I choose that one? It's because this entire time leading up to this, we just had a test on classical cinema. So if now you know the classical cinema tropes, what is considered classical, why it's considered classical based on our historical trajectory, how do I get you to realize, this is again formatting, how do I get you to understand what is genuinely different about what aesthetic styles are genuinely different based on aesthetic norms about Japanese culture that just would not make sense for you if you're developing a style saying, yeah, I'm going to keep doing what is the most Western to make this Hollywood type style kind of form. But yet it just does not make sense for me to take this one from it because our audiences won't read it that way. Does this make sense to you? Almost everything is going to be the same. So then when we see the stylistic things that are different, we know that that is a cultural thing, right? We know that that is something that just will not fit to adopt that directly over from Western filmmaking. This is why I have you watch that, but I include plenty of clips in here from Ozu regardless. So I just wanted to skip to the end to like kind of preface it with that so that you're more aware of the reason I did that going forward. Okay. Rashomon is the big breakthrough, the one that we watched, wins an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, 1951. It's unusual among Japanese films because it's so hyper-modernistic in its narrative. It's not what most Japanese filmmakers are like, not even what most of Kurosawa's films are like, but this is kind of the artsy one that allows you to see if he's the most Western, what are the differences, right? This leads us to figuring out that historical Japanese films are more interesting to outside audiences than contemporary ones, leading to a sort of orientalizing the self-image. This is also what we talked about in terms of Black filmmaking with stereotyping of the self-image due to outside demand, right? So while the US is discouraging all these nationalist, historical films, then eventually it learns how profitable they can be abroad, right? So they're discouraging it because they're scared of what it might mean for them to have a conservative view, to want to conserve their culture, to have conservative politics in Japan. Then they realize if we allow them to make it, it's going to be mega profitable. So what you're getting from them is not like this genuine view of samurai. It's what they think. It's this overhyped stereotypical view of samurai because they know that it's going to do well in other audiences. And this is again has been a problem that we've seen in plenty of like black cinema, right? It's this over stereotype. It's specifically, it is not talking about white filmmakers or white producers who make either black actors do stereotypical roles or whatnot. This is talking about when either Japanese cinema in this case or black producers make their own narratives and characters super stereotyped because they know that it will do well because the stereotype is profitable. This is what we're talking about right now. So they get a problem of self-stereotyping and orientalizing of the self-image due to man, right? Ugetsu, you don't have to watch this clip, but it's there if you do want to. So Kenzo Mizoguchi is most famous for mise-en-scène, moving camera, long takes. One of the all-time legendary camera-moving filmmakers alongside Kubrick. This is why I include it, because if you are a Kubrick technical fan, I want you to be able to have this reference. Full title is Ugetsu Monogatari in Japanese, and Mizoguchi wasn't particularly educated or well-trained. He wasn't like a formal filmmaker like we've been discussing in terms of how filmmaking is finally becoming formalized, and it's becoming a practice in which filmmakers are also theorizing about it. He's known for putting hidden cuts into his film, and if you look at that, it says in parentheses, show the final picnic scene. If you do want to go see that and you type in Ugetsu, you will see it's trying to replicate the flatness of the art, like illustration without depth, right? And the cinematographer in this is the same for the movie as in Rashomon, which I did have you watch. So I am going to butcher his first name if I try to say it. We're just going to call him Ozu. I do want you to watch the famous vase scene in Late Spring because it has been talked about in so many film essays, including the Thompson, not Bordwell, but Thompson, who is one of your textbook authors, who is trying to find meaning from the weird shot of it. The plot is about a woman who has to marry. The camera is positioned super low, and this is Ozu's famous low position. He's always doing it in this position. It's part of a auteur type, and this is where we'll get to, you'll see it bold in the next paragraph, parametric filmmaker. So it's barely angled upward to look at the events, right? And you'll see it's just positioned low. When she stands up, the conventional practice usually would say, you follow her. That's where the action is. Or if it doesn't follow her, it would at least angle towards her, right? He doesn't. He leaves it. That's how you know it's an auteuristic detail. So he's a perfect example of a parametric filmmaker, which means that it comes from parameters, right? It means that he has intentionally pared his style down. He doesn't break these rules. Even though these rules are not conventional rules, right, like we just addressed, he says, these are specific parameters I don't cross. The vase shot looks like she's looking up, so she's not technically looking at it, and yet randomly when you look at the vase, her face changes like she's somehow affected by its presence. That's why it's so stark, right? Is this weirdness about the scene. So we get a sequence of shots in a sort of environment that look like a still life, but with movement. He often uses these kinds of sequences as transitions. This would be what we call especially like exposition that we use in traditional, except instead of it setting the scene, he's using it as a transitory period. They rarely contain people. The people are usually far away if they are there, which again will be reminiscent of paintings, right? The eyeline matches will seem off, as if they're poorly done, but clearly intentional. This again is flashing us back to how eyeline matches even work in general. While most people are trying to preserve the continuity of that, they're trying to say, look, it's clearly coming from his eyes. As we saw in Back to the Future, it doesn't have to be that way for the audience to register it as that. It's their perspective, even if you know that it's coming, even if it looks at them and then it clearly looks from a different position, right? When people confronted him about the bad eyeline shots as bad editing, he'd simply say, it doesn't matter, or people don't care, which is true. That's what we just said. Doesn't need to strictly adhere to any sort of spatial continuity to be in the direct point of view spot that it would have been in. Stray Dog by Kurosawa, you don't have to watch this, but again, you can. Showdown scene, we would watch it if we were in class together. It's the film he made right before Rashomon. The synopsis about the reason I would watch this is because it's so fucking funny. Excuse my language, but it's absolutely hilarious if you watch it. I get at least 2 laughs from this collectively in class every time. So the gun was stolen from this man who is a cop. It's been used in murders since it was stolen from him, and the cop spends the entire movie tracking it down. So you see that the piano player in this clip is producing the music, showing that it's unexpectedly within the diegesis, which is the narrative within the diegetic. But he never returns to her ever in the movie again, even though this random piano player is shown in such a hilarious way. Then again, the kids randomly singing as these 2 guys are, and then you realize they're in the story, even though you thought it was background music. It's just this hilarious play on both formal and like children and people who have to witness these people trying to grapple with this gun. One man is broken by his war experience, the other is a cop. It's also about Japan's loss in World War II. He has like 3 of these movies, and then the one that I usually assign for one of my aesthetics classes, I can't, upper and lower, it's one of those kinds of things, is also about modernism, the modernist period specifically, and Japan's historical transition. So he's a super historically minded filmmaker. I need to get that title right. I should probably care about that. Kurosawa, up higher and lower maybe. Sorry. High and Low. Okay, it's called High and Low. Sorry about that. I should, being a film instructor, get those things right. So if you want to watch it, it's called High and Low. It's very good, but usually only if you know things about I guess the allegory that would be going on. So, because Kurosawa, we show him in this class because of that, because he's talking about the history, and that's why I show you the movie that I showed you, because it's specifically, hopefully you'll be able to read the allegory. I'm probably going to ask you this in your discussion for this week. I would try to think through which characters are representing which nation. And it's very obvious which one the US is, because he's so absolutely fucking obnoxious, which is still the way. Background for me, when I was in undergrad, I was I was president of the International Club, I was also a global ambassador who spoke to other people about why they should study abroad. I continued that into my master's, where I was very, global minded and whatnot. It's why I think through like global histories and economies as well. Right now. So it's one of the things that if you do ever go abroad, it's very obviously still our perception of this, is that stereotypical US aggressive, we love guns and whatnot. What is one of the few positive things that we do have going for us in terms of a cultural thing, is that we are very friendly, which is true. We're abnormally friendly, almost annoyingly friendly. Again, like some of them see that as a drawback, right? We're in people's faces, and whatnot. And so I think you should think through that allegory, and I love thinking it through together, and I'm very sad we don't get to do that anymore. So, he produces large-scale events from individualistic perspectives. Again, that's why we show him. He narrows these very big kinds of ideas down into representative people. Kurosawa isn't exactly representative of Japanese filmmaking at this time, however. If you want to see that, Ozu is the one you need to go to, which is why I would check out that clip, the Stray Dog clip, because it's both hilarious. It's the best one you'll find to get more of a Japanese new wave auteur type filmmaking, and how stark and weird it is, right? And specifically how he does things that Hollywood says you should never do. Whereas Kurosawa, you're going to get things that you've seen before plenty of times. Let me move on. We look at the pace of Kurosawa. We notice that he doesn't keep up with our efficiency-motivated, fast-paced type action, right? It's not about moving the plot forward constantly. And you think about that specifically. What cultural value does it play into that it wouldn't make sense? Why wouldn't that make sense for their audiences? Well, what are they getting the most pleasure out of? They value pleasure in terms of relationship building. They also value equal affordances to what is best for the collective over individualistic. So it makes more sense for you. One of the things that we just did not do until around, we're getting like new waves and getting influenced by new waves that we didn't do ever in classical cinema filmmaking, is we always had one or two protagonists. we had almost none more. Now you see in this narrative, we have like 5 different protagonists, and they're very easily hopping from whose perspective should be afforded as the most ethical, in which all of them are the good guys, all of them are the bad guys whenever they tell their story, which we don't even really get in the US. We have entire film classes devoted to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because that was one of the really big TV shows that even kicked off our ability to be able to afford to, while Buffy's still the hero, right, to start being able to afford to giving some of that to other people's perspectives. It's why we start to have like things like Marvel now to this day, where we can have an Avengers movie where like they're all the heroes and they all get perspectives, but then they all operate around the same ideology. So are you really jumping from, right, or are you just changing out who the surface level person that has to be accounted for? Again, that's the question. That's always the question that we ask in this class. And that's the question that you have to trace based on aesthetics, right? So they don't keep up with pace because they value the relationship building. They also don't keep up with the only 1 or 2 heroes that we saw in the classical plot because they care about the collective, right? There was one other thing that I usually list in that, but I haven't watched it again recently, and so I won't pick it out for you here, and I won't expect you to know it unless I address it in the next lecture. Rashomon is also very modernist. He's dealing with truth. Can we know what truth is, or can we only approach it by incorporating various subjective perspectives? Who select particular data and construct a story and interpret it? This is shot on location. He systematically shoots in the sun. Miyagawa, who is the cinematographer that we just talked about earlier, invented these reflectors to get sunlight specifically into the forest in very magical type ways, which you will see. Almost all of the budget was literally spent on reconstructing the destroyed gate, which was a historical south gate to Kyoto hundreds of years ago, around 1100 AD samurai era, and Rashomon is the name of the gate. That's why it's called it. I do finally at the end of this include this 24 Eyes clip. The Are You Going to Cry Because We Lost, because it's about this rural school teacher in Japan with a class of 12 students, hence 24 Eyes. And it's historically the most beloved film in Japan. Likely, again, not necessarily still true, but was true at one point in time. And I include that again in case you are interested in these topics, especially since this class is so Western-minded because of it being a historical perspective, right? It's incredibly Eurocentric. So if you are interested in these things that are not as Eurocentric, I want to at least give you the materials to be able to go start researching it on your own and finding right from there what other movies could I branch out upon. But that is the end of this lecture. I may end up talking a little more about Rashomon, seeing if I can't watch it again and giving you some details. But that's it. I will hopefully record the next 2 lectures this weekend so that I can get you ahead again. And I will talk to you soon.